My name is Elijah Navarro Munoz, and for my film history final project, I'm going to be doing a presentation on the overview and analysis of the technique of editing and detail, which is realism. In this presentation, the topics I'm going to be covering, firstly, are the techniques of realism in films and how exactly these techniques are displayed in the films that we see nowadays and in old days. Oftentimes, we see them happening a lot, and they're very common in modern films, but especially in old day films. Secondly, we are going to be talking about what exactly originated and encouraged realism in films. What made people want to practice the concept of realism in films, and what exactly made them want to start incorporating realism in their films. If you don't mind, I'm going to swipe that to the side. And thirdly, we're going to be speaking about how a specific filmmaker, which we will later be mentioning, presented the use of realism in his films and how he introduced them extremely strong in his films. So, realism, invented in the early 1920s, is notoriously known as the style in films which is heavily based on the concept of realistically creating a scenario of emotions that the everyday person experiences. And realism is purposefully intentional with its ways of capturing everyday life, routines, and so forth. Realism creates this sort of backbone with storytelling that allows you to see the everyday life of a character, creating a further advancement in the storyline. And as an example, I put Marriage Story, which stars Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson. If you know this film, you know that this is based on a very rocky marriage, and I would suggest that you watch it, but it heavily incorporates realism and it incorporates it so well. Um, I feel like realism really creates this stance for the audience to feel like they are watching this film, they are witnessing this film in real time, and they are there themselves. So, yeah, moving on. I also want to mention more examples of realism aside from Marriage Story and its techniques which are displayed in modern day and old day filmmaking. In modern day filmmaking, I chose to mention The Florida Project, which was released in 2017, which is based on the story of 6-year-old Mooney, who is almost living in this fantasy land. She's living in this fantasy world, but unfortunately, she's also facing difficult, a very difficult, neglectful situation through her mother, um, who is experiencing financial struggles, and it adapts more throughout the film, but we see that heavily happening throughout the course of the film. But we also see Mooney's sort of display of fantasy heavily throughout the film as well, especially towards the end where she gets taken by the foster care system due to her mother not paying bills and eventually getting kicked out. Um, and yeah, I feel like it's just really incorporative with realism because it gives us as audience, we know what's really happening to Mooney, but Mooney doesn't know what's happening to Mooney. It's just a really sad movie overall, but it's also very nostalgic. I remember when I first watched it, it was really impactful. So, another example that I would like to mention for old day filmmaking that incorporates realism is Bicycle Thieves, which tells the story of an unemployed husband who unfortunately doesn't have a job up until a certain point. His name is Antonio, who is finally able to get a job after consistently struggling with his wife. Keep in mind, during this time, a lot of socioeconomic struggles were happening, so that is a very heavy topic that is mentioned consistently throughout this movie, or it's key almost to what this movie is based on. His wife, Maria, decides to sell their bed linens in order to scrape by money because his bike, or a bike that he wanted, I am actually, um, yeah, it was a bike that he previously had. They decided to buy it at a pawn shop, so she scraped money in order to get that back. He bought it back, but unfortunately, he wasn't able to get it back fully. It was stolen, and him and his son Bruno ultimately hunt down and investigate the matter. It's also really important to remember that the reason that Maria decided to sell the bed linens was because he had no other way of transporting to the new job that he had just gotten. This film specifically incorporates realism as it practices the use of non-professional actors. Non-professional actors were hired for this film to sort of create that display of what the lives of everyday average people are like. And like I mentioned before, it also displays socioeconomic struggles. So, yeah. Moving on, what exactly originated and encouraged the use of realism in films? I would like to mention Andre Bazin's book, What is Media, and his theory of realism, which permanently set the pavement for filmmakers who are interested in the theory of realism as a whole and incorporate that into their films, like I've said before. Bazin created this wave of encouragement in using realism in films and art as a whole, um, specifically through encouraging techniques such as deep focus, long takes, and correct me if I'm wrong, mise en scène, which properly allow for the audience to interpret and invest themselves in the scene that is in front of them and allows them a new perspective, allows them their own perspective, if anything. Um, Bazin was very big on the theory of realism, personally stating himself that the ability to capture, oh, apologies, that the most important aspect of cinema comes from its ability to capture the truth of reality. He made his stance extremely clear, and Bazin is a very culturally significant figure in the films that are based on realism that we see now. And yeah, lastly, I would like to mention a specific filmmaker which was presented in chapter 6 of our textbook who constantly used realism in his films, Eric von Stroheim. Eric von Stroheim is a very culturally significant figure, and he has ties to David Wark Griffith, somebody else that we've also consistently seen throughout our textbook. And he worked with him. This is really interesting. I would just like to throw this in here because I found it really intriguing when I was reading through this, when I first read chapter 6. So he worked with him as an assistant and a bit player on his film Intolerance, which is also extremely notorious. We haven't specifically covered it in our class multiple times, but I know it's been mentioned a few times. But yeah, an example of the films that Eric von Stroheim used and incorporated realism in is his 1920 film Greed, which is based on a housewife, Frina, who ends up winning the lottery but ultimately becomes very miserable and paranoid because she is convinced that her husband and his friend, um, she's convinced that her husband and his friend are out to get her financially and are setting her up for failure and wanting to take her money. This ultimately becomes a very huge problem throughout her relationship and ultimately results in her husband murdering her for the purpose of financial gain. So, I want to also talk about how specifically Eric von Stroheim practiced theory of realism and realism as a whole in his films. Stroheim was extremely notorious for his use of lighting techniques, shot techniques, specifically close-ups to represent the intensity of the scenarios that are happening in the film, and symbolic imagery, motifs, and also just creating that dramatic effect in his films. And lastly, this was all for the purpose of capturing human nature. That is the end of my presentation. I really appreciate you sticking till the end.